Okay, so this week's training is going to be a part 2, basically, to last time's. Last time we talked about active supervision and how part of actively supervising these kids is making sure that they're staying safe. And the safety and security is normally taught alongside with it, but I wanted to make sure that we were giving the attention to both trainings that it deserved and needed. So we'll talk about safety and security this time. Again, if you have questions throughout, feel free to chat or to just unmute yourself, and I will ask questions as well throughout. But getting into it, a couple different ways of maintaining the safety that childcare licensing has put in place. They recommend that we do something called keeping the count, which is where you regularly count the children with a name to a face. This will allow for the earliest possible knowledge that a child has gone missing if they do end up slipping out of your eyesight. And with that earlier awareness of a child being missing, we can typically get to them before they go too far, before they get in trouble, before they slip into any unobserved location as well. So again, they recommend with the name to the face so that you know exactly who is missing as well, as soon as possible. They typically recommend that while you're doing it throughout the day, you're making sure to do it at least before you leave an area and then before you return to an area, such as outside time. Typically, I see this where they will have everybody line up before you go outside. You'll do your name to face head count. And then same thing before you come back in from outside, they'll line back up and you will do your name to face count as well there. Again, really simple, easy way to maintain safety and make sure that we've got all the kids that we need to have while they're in care with us. Another way that they ask for us to maintain safety during nap time, specifically this one refers to when a camera is being used to monitor sleeping children versus when caregivers are actively in the room. If the caregivers are actively in the room, none of this actually is applicable. But if a camera is being used, the provider needs to make sure that all of these things are being met, such as the napping room needs to be adjacent to a non-napping room. And down here, it will say that there is an open barrier or an open door without a barrier, such as a gate between the napping room and the non-napping room. The provider also needs to make sure that there is a staff member in the non-napping room at all times. So even though you aren't in the napping room, there still needs to be a caregiver that is actively present and can easily access the children. If you're using cameras or mirrors, they need to be positioned so that the staff member can see and hear each child. So if you've got your monitor up, the camera needs to be able to see all of the kids. And then when kids do wake up from the nap, the staff member needs to move those children from the napping room to the non-napping room. Again, this is all only applicable when it comes to not being actively in the napping room. Most daycares, their napping room is the same thing as their non-napping room. So it's not typically something you will need to worry about. And then for napping children who are in a crib, the caregiver needs to make sure that there is not a blanket or other object obstructing the view into the crib. Why would that be something that we need to be making sure of?
I think it's just important because we need to be able to be watching the kids at all time. So if the camera, we can't see them, then we don't know if they're suffocating or if they're gonna.
Yeah, yeah. You cut off a little bit there at the end, but it is true. Like we need to be able to see into the crib. And even if they're not actively suffocating on the blanket that's obstructing the view, if there's something else in there that they are suffocating on, that's something we need to be aware of. Other reasons that this wouldn't be a good idea of having an object blocking our view into the crib.
You wouldn't know if they were awake or not. And some
Yep.
kids will sit in their crib for an hour and not make a noise. Others will make, known that they're awake right away. So it's good to know when they do wake up.
So those two that you both just mentioned are the biggest reasons that I think of when it comes to not obstructing our view. So we do want to make sure that they're safe, they're not suffocating, they're breathing fine. But also some kids are totally content just laying in there awake. And part of the licensing rules that we follow is that any awake children are in that non-napping area. But it's also, again, like they could lay there forever and we would never know that they're actually up and about. So not having that obstruction is pretty key to making sure these kids are safe in those cribs, as well as we know when they're awake and ready to get their diaper changed after their nap. So access to children. Parents should have access to their children and the areas in the center that the child would be in while in care. So this means that if there's a gym that the children might be having access to, the parents need to have access to both the classroom and the gym. Anywhere in the daycare that their child might be, parents should have access to that. There was a point in time, specifically at the very beginning and most way through COVID, where this rule was not followed by instructions of childcare licensing as well as the CDC. So parents at some daycares couldn't even leave their cars to drop off their children or to pick them up. Most daycares at this point in time, though, have moved back to following this rule pretty closely. So parents can come back to the classrooms, check on their children. Why would this be important? Why, as a parent, would it be important to have access to your kids?
I'm a parent right now. I have a little 3-month-old, and I did a job where he was in the nursery, and if just in my head, I was like, if there's an emergency and we need to go, I knew where he was and that I had access to the room and I could grab him. Or if for some reason I just wanted to go check on him for my own safety of mind, that was an option, to build trust in the center as well as the caregivers. Just knowing that he's okay at any given point is a bit of a comforting thought.
For sure. You touched on a couple different things there. One, emergency situations do happen, and so being able to access your child as quickly as possible is always important. But it does give that comfort of mind, that ease of mind, knowing that at any point in time you can just check up and see what your child is doing, what their day is looking like, how the caregivers are with them. Other ideas as to why this would be important.
Maybe also just a parent that has an emergency outside of the daycare center, and they've got to get their child really quickly. And I know that in that case, they'd have to check out with somebody at the front desk or an administrator, but maybe just knowing that they can go wherever their child is for safety reasons, like, I don't know, a death in the family or an accident or something like that, is good to be able to get to your child wherever they are.
Yeah, definitely. Again, in those emergency situations, knowing where they are as well.
You're cutting out, Annaleah, you're cutting out, sorry.
Yeah, so just definitely in those emergency situations, it's always best to have access to your kids and the places that they would be. So if they are outside when the emergency happens, but their stuff is all in their classroom, having access to both places is important. I will go back and touch on the ease of mind in just a second as well, because I think that there's some important things to address with that. But another reason is for any of our infants or toddlers that are being breastfed, it is important that the mom has access to them at feeding times, whether they're in gym time at the time of feeding, or if they're in the classroom at the time that they need to be fed. Being able to access them is best, because they are trying to work out being at work, but being able to also take as quick of a break as possible to feed their kids. But going back to that ease of mind, we have done trainings on child abuse in the past. Sadly, it is not just family members or people outside of the daycare that do sometimes abuse these kids. Sometimes it does happen with caregivers in a daycare. We do our best to try and screen those that we allow into daycares, but there are still some people that manage to slip through. So if a parent is able to come in at any point in time and check up on their kids, it increases the likelihood that those situations won't ever happen. It puts more responsibility on the caregivers to make sure that we are treating these kids nicely and fairly, while still teaching them how to be human beings. But it does put responsibility on both sides. Of caregivers get to watch out for those red flags and signs of abuse that come from the home, but these parents also are able to have more of that contact with caregivers and make sure that there aren't any red flags or signs of abuse in these daycares. So it's definitely really big when it comes to that ease of mind, because it does put more responsibility on the caregivers. Any questions before we move on to this next part? Okay, so the next few slides we'll talk about keeping records, why it's important, what that process looks like. 6 different rules when it comes to the clocking in and clocking out process for each of these kids that daycares have to make sure they're following. But then we'll also talk about how that rule varies very slightly in emergency situations. So the very first rule is that each and every child, every single day, needs to be signed in and signed out. Whether this is done electronically on a piece of paper, it depends on the daycare and provider of how they actually keep these records. But every single day, each child needs to be signed in and signed out. And along with this, if a child is signed out for a doctor's appointment, but they will be coming back, they need to be signed out for the doctor's appointment and then signed back in after they come back from the doctor's appointment as well. So anytime a child comes into a daycare, they need to be signed in, and anytime they leave, they need to be signed out. The second rule is that only parents or individuals with written authorization from the parent may sign out a child. So this is written beforehand. Only people that are on an approved list can come and check out a child. When it comes to checking in a child, it doesn't need to be a person with written authorization. So if they went and spent the night at grandma's house and grandma wasn't necessarily on this list, grandma could still sign them out or sign them into daycare, but they would need to get that written authorization and be able to prove that it came from the parent before they could sign out a child. Along with this, the third rule, if it is a new individual that the daycare provider and caregivers don't know, they have to provide photo identification that they are the individual signing the child out. So even though I have written that Uncle John can come in and sign my children out, if the provider has never met that person before, he would have to provide that photo ID that has his name, and it needs to match the written authorization. The fourth rule is that individuals signing children in and out have to use identifiers such as a signature, initial, or electronic code. Typically, people that do it on paper will use just the initials of the parent. And then for those daycares that do it on electronic devices, they normally will have like a 4 to 6 digit code that is unique and individual as part of a signing in and signing out process. And then rule 5, the sign in and sign out records have to include the date and time each child arrives and leaves. So again, in cases where they are leaving for the doctors, they would have 4 sign in and sign out date and times. This also means that you can't just do a sign in on Monday for Monday through Friday. You have to sign the person in every single time with the correct date and time that the child arrives and leaves daycare. And then lastly, there needs to be written permission from the child's parent if school-aged children sign themselves in or out. Most daycares, you won't see this happen, but for your school-aged kids, sometimes they can come in and sign themselves in and sign themselves out, but they have to have that written permission beforehand from the parent specifically. Daycare providers also have to make sure that they keep a 6-week record of each child's attendance on site. This is for a couple different reasons, but that's something that the providers need to make sure that they're doing. It's not necessarily something that you ever need to be aware of. And then lastly, in emergency situations, the provider can accept a verbal authorization for a new person to come and sign a child out if they can identify both the parent giving that verbal authorization, and then they still have to have that photo ID of the individual picking up the child to confirm again that the names match. So in emergency situations, really the only rule that changes is that you can accept verbal authorization versus that written authorization. Are there any questions about anything that we went over in this training? Okay, Is there anything, comments or anything that anybody would add to what I've talked about in the training today? Okay.